Chapter 17. Sophie. The Map Room. Sophie should have been thinking about the snake. The snake that had Arthur's blood. The snake that had terrorized the woods. The snake that had killed their friend and would kill them next. And yet she couldn't stop thinking about hydrangeas. The whole castle's crawling with them, she whispered to Agatha, nodding at the thousands of pom-pom-shaped flowers in pink, purple and yellow, blanketing every inch of Castle Jolie. I loathe hydrangeas, Aggie. They look like human brains. Just being around them makes me faint. Shh! Agatha snapped, then kept on whispering to Nicola. Sophie stewed as the chain gang pulled her along deeper into the royal castle. The young pirate named Thiago, with the tattoos around his eyes, leading them on foot. The other pirates had remained outside the castle on their horses, sneering down at the crew as they shambled through the open doors like dead men walking to the gallows. Sophie watched the boys deliver each kid a demeaning kick in the bum. Hester, Annadil, Dot, Hort, Bogdan, Willem. But when it came to Sophie's turn, sunburned Wesley simply smirked and gave her a frightening little hiss, which made it all the more foolish that with the snake moments away, Sophie was offended by flowers. But it wasn't really the hydrangeas that were bothering her, though she did hate everything about this castle, its birthday cake colours, its cloying candy cane scent, its treacly portraits of the royal children frolicking with dogs, and its endless loop of music, playing Jaunt Jolie's annoyingly catchy anthem through flowered walls. Tipple-top, joy and jaunt, come and be jolie. No, the real reason Sophie was annoyed was because she'd just saved everyone's noses in the pavilion with her brave performance, and no one seemed to care. Especially Agatha and Nicola, who kept whispering to each other like Flopsy and Mopsy. Sophie couldn't fault Agatha for having another friend. Aggie was perfectly free to consort with whoever she pleased, including a first-year reader with a bad attitude. So why, then, did Sophie feel so upset? She'd been so distracted by her reunion with Agatha and all the action of their new quest that she hadn't noticed a creeping emptiness returning. The same emptiness that had made her impatient with her students at school, increasingly bored with her dean's duties, and eager to comb Camelot's tabloids for sordid rumours about its new king. And yet, Sophie hadn't been able to put a finger on why she felt this way. She was happy being dean, wasn't she? That was the ever-after she'd worked so hard to find, and at the end of this quest she'd go right back to it, just like Agatha would go back to a wedding and a crown. Yet, unlike Agatha, Sophie would have no one by her side. Well, at least not the way that Agatha had Tedros. But that was fine with her, truly. She might flirt with delectable Everboys at parties, and ogle a few of her own sultry Neverboys during school assemblies, but she'd learned her lesson with Tedros and Rafal. No boy could ever really understand her. She was too strong and empowered and complicated. Boys always wanted her to change, and she didn't want to change. Not when she'd finally figured herself out. She'd be far better off staying out of that swamp for a long, long time. No, the only person Sophie needed was Agatha. Agatha understood her. Agatha balanced her. Agatha didn't expect her to change, which is why Sophie had been so happy these past few days with her best friend back in her life. But seeing Agatha confide in this Nicola girl the way Agatha had once confided in her made Sophie realize how fragile this happiness was. It was ironic, really. Agatha would have been happy living in Gaveldon forever with Sophie, but it was Sophie who had been determined to leave and find her own life. Now it was Agatha who had her own life, a life that didn't depend on Sophie anymore. She heard Nicola whisper her name, and Sophie promptly goosed Agatha with her knee. "Are you two talking about me?" Agatha scowled. "We're talking about our plan to fight the snake. So now I'm not good enough to help you plan? I'll tell you the plan if you're quiet," Nicola said. "See how she talks to me?" Sophie mewled to Agatha. "Because you're acting like a mopstick," Agatha scolded. "You ungrateful Brutus! Not one word about how clever I was out there diffusing those vile men. Not one word of appreciation." "Sorry, we've been busy planning how not to die. I remember when instead of gossiping about me with first years, it was me and you who made plans. You are the plan, you idiot." "What?" Sophie blurted loudly. The chain yanked to a halt. Slowly the two girls looked up to see Thiago glaring daggers at them from the head of the line. Dark silence fell over the hall, punctured by gay sounds of singing, "Tipple-top, joy and jaunt." The pirate stabbed his sword into a flowered wall, and the music squawked and petered out. He gave the girls a last glower of warning, and the death march resumed. Agatha and Nicola stared Sophie down. Sophie reddened. If she was indeed the team's plan to fight the snake, now she'd have to do it without knowing what the plan was. Steeling herself, she followed the line into the royal keep, the king and queen's private residence, as evidenced by the preponderance of children's bedrooms, cosy sitting rooms, and opulent bathrooms. Sophie peeked in, unnerved by an unmade bed, an open bottle of wine in one of the sitting rooms, a wooden toothbrush askew by the sink. signs of life, but no one living there. At the front of the line, Hester coughed in surprise, snagging the chain. Sophie followed her eyes, as did everyone else. The library was coming into view. A 2-floor yellow and pink rotunda cased in glass. Inside the library, 3 giant steel cages hung from the high ceiling, each packed to the brim with maids, guards, stewards, and members of the royal family. 2 shirtless teen pirates, one thin and dark, the other hoggish with pig-coloured skin, were perched on the railing of the 2nd floor. They took turns kicking the cages as hard as they could and watched them swing back and forth, tossing all the people inside like marbles while they screamed and cried, though Sophie couldn't hear any of it through the thick glass. The pirates looked bored. As one of them punted a cage, Sophie saw the king of Jaunt Jolie tumbling inside, his royal robe slashed and stained, his crown points speared with rotted fruit, as he tried to grip on to 2 bawling boys. The same little boys Sophie had seen playing with the dog in the foyer painting. The dog was cowering beneath a woman's blue gown in another cage, anticipating the next kick. The line pulled Sophie forward, and the library started to recede from view. Through the glass she met the eyes of the king, who spotted her as his cage stopped swinging. His eyes watered as he clasped his hands, appealing to her for help, his tear-stained boys tucked at his sides. Sophie could only gawk back like a tourist in a sadistic museum, being pulled to the next display. This man's wife has been killed for satchels of gold, she thought sickly. Were these his boys? Sophie felt her own eyes grow wet. His now motherless boys? Sophie thought of Honora's 2 young sons, just like these, who her father, Stefan, loved so much. Agatha elbowed her, and Sophie saw her best friend nodding subtly at the next cage about to be kicked, the one with the dog cowering beneath the woman in the blue gown. Only now Sophie got a good look at the woman's petrified face and gasped. It was the same face they'd seen on that poster in the pavilion. The one stamped, "Executed." The Queen of Jaunt Jolie was alive? Astonished, Sophie and Agatha watched the Queen try valiantly to reach through her cage bars and touch her children and husband as their cage swung past. The chain jerked Sophie and Agatha forward, and the library was out of sight. Dragged ahead, Sophie thought back to the Lady of the Lake, who'd looked just as tortured as the Queen of Jaunt Jolie. The snake could have killed the sorceress in Avalon, but instead he'd drained her magic and left her feckless and afraid. He could have killed this queen too, but instead he peddled news of her death. And he could have left Avalon without a trace, but instead he'd left that map in Chaddock's hands to taunt them. He's always one step ahead, like Evelyn Sader and Rafal used to be, Sophie thought. And this one plays games too, just like them. An unsettling thought crossed her mind. But why? If he has Arthur's blood, if he thinks he can pull Excalibur, why play games? Sophie held her breath. Was it really Camelot's crown the snake was after? Or was he after something else, something more? The line halted in front of her, and Sophie broke from her trance to see golden double doors at the end of the hall. They opened magically, revealing a room Sophie couldn't quite make out from this far back in line. Suddenly, her cuffs split open. So did Agatha's, and the piece of chain between them levitated into the air, turning black and shiny like an eel, before it flew off into the room, vanishing from view. "You too," Thiago said, pointing a grubby fingernail at them. "Come here." Sophie and Agatha clasped each other's hands. The tattooed pirate gestured ahead with his sword, directing the two girls through the gold doors. Holding hands tighter, Sophie and Agatha stepped out of line and entered the room. They looked back at the pirate and the rest of their friends still chained in the hall, gaping through the doorway. "He's waiting," Thiago said darkly. Agatha swiveled to Nicola, eyes wide. The door slammed shut, leaving Sophie and Agatha inside alone. Neither girl moved. "All that planning with your new friend?" said Sophie softly. "And here we are, you and me, like always." Agatha didn't answer. They peered around warily, expecting a trap. "No one's here," Agatha said, letting Sophie's hand go. The first thing Sophie noticed about the room is that it was enormous, as vast and high as one of the ballrooms in the School for Good and Evil, lined with tall pillars. There were no doors, no windows, and no furniture, except for a long black stone table at the rear of the room. The second thing Sophie noticed was that the room was green. Whereas most of Jaunt Jolie featured Easter egg hues, here the carpet, pillars and walls were a deep, luminous emerald, textured with shiny, snake-like scales. The torches on the walls crackled with green flames. Sophie knew this colour well. It was the colour of her own eyes, as well as the colour of Rafal's old school that had sought to turn her good classmates evil. But here it felt out of place, as if they'd passed through a portal into another realm. There was something that wasn't green, though, Sophie realised, looking upwards. 6 parchment maps floated in rows above the centre of the room, each as big as a flag. "It's a map room," said Agatha, moving towards them. "A what?" said Sophie. "Tedros showed me Camelot on our first night in the castle. It was where his father used to meet with his round table. It had floating maps of neighbouring kingdoms just like this. Tedros couldn't wait to hold meetings there with his knights, but he never got the chance." Sophie saw sadness in her friend's eyes, but there was no time for that now. "Do you recognize any of the maps at least? I don't see labels on them," she said, gripping one by its corner and holding it while it tried to sail off like a balloon. "This one looks like Avalon. See, here's the sea around the kingdom, and the big gates, and the lake—" Her throat closed up. "Aggie?" The map had a three-dimensional toy figurine positioned on top of the lake. The same exact figurine they'd seen on her and Professor Dovey's enchanted maps. The figurine was labelled Chaddick, his name crossed out. Stomach fluttering, Sophie let go of the map and rushed to catch hold of the next. More figurines inched across black, rocky terrain. Rovin, Arachne, Drax. Agatha grabbed onto a map with clear-coloured mountains. Kiko, Giselle, Hero. Another with purple hills had Vex, Brone, Mona. "They're our quest maps," said Sophie, instinctively touching the gold vial on her neck to make sure it was still there. "No wonder he knows our names and faces and could see us coming. No wonder the quests are going badly," Agatha said breathlessly, watching Kiko's figurine inch across the map. "Sophie, he can track all our moves. That's how he sent thugs to every kingdom and sabotaged their quests. But I thought Kiko's and Vex's teams were missing," said Sophie. "Not missing, just not responding to Dovey's messages," said Agatha, glancing between maps. "But why do all the teams seem to be moving in the same direction?" Sophie jumped up and snagged the next map, spotting a peanut-shaped shoreline, a pavilion on a hill, and a pastel-coloured castle. "Here's Jaunt Jolie," she said, spotting figurines labelled Sophie and Agatha against the castle, while Hester, Annadel, Dot, Bogdan, Nicola and Hort were moving out the back of the castle in a single file line through what looked like the royal gardens. "The pirates are taking them somewhere," Sophie said. Her eyes flared. On the opposite side of the castle, far from the pirates and the captive crew, she saw 3 more blue-labelled names on the map, lurking in a forest. Beatrix, Rena, Millicent. "Sophie," Agatha choked. Sophie spun around. Agatha was holding on to the maps with Kiko's and Vex's teams, one with each hand, both threatening to tug her off the ground. Gritting her teeth, she muscled them like puzzle pieces next to the one Sophie was holding. "Look at where they're going," said Agatha. For a moment, Sophie didn't understand. Then she saw it. The missing quest teams were each headed towards a corner of their maps. So was Rovan's team. So was the crew of the Igraine. 4 teams. 4 corners. All meeting at the same point, a short distance from where Sophie's and Agatha's figurines stood now. "The 4-point," said Agatha. "They're all going to the 4-point." She looked at Sophie. "Which means the Snake's thugs didn't just sabotage their quests. They must have kidnapped them too. That's why they aren't responding to Dovey. Because all of them are in the Snake's hands." The 2 girls slowly raised their eyes to the only map left, floating over their heads. Tedros. Alone in Camelot. Agatha stiffened. "We don't even know if these maps are real," Sophie argued quickly. "Dovey said only the Storian can make a quest map. How can the Snake have the Storian's maps? This could be more hocus-pocus to scare us, just like he lied about killing the Queen." But Agatha wasn't paying attention any more. "Listen," she said. A soft scratching sound filled the room, like a cat clawing at a window. It was coming from the black stone table against the back wall. The 2 girls approached, their shoes padding on the green carpet. A gold-covered book lay open on the table. Hovering above, a magical pen drew on a blank page a painting of the 2 girls as they were right now, gazing at a black pen, drawing in a storybook. The book on the table looked just like the one in the schoolmaster's tower that held their new fairy tale, and the pen floating over it drew in the same bold colours and clean lines as the Storian. Only this pen didn't look like the Storian, Sophie thought, peering closer. It was black, for one thing, not silver, and it wasn't steel like the Storian. It was flexible and eel-like, as if made out of sticky black goo, contorting with every stroke. It looked a lot like the piece of chain that had magically released her and Agatha before it flew into this room. Plus, the pen didn't have those strange symbols carved into its side either. Instead, it seemed to be covered in scales. Beneath the painting of the 2 girls, it wrote a caption. "One of them would die today. But which one?" Sophie saw the horror in Agatha's face. "It's lying, Aggie. It's not the real story. It's not the Storian." But Agatha was dead white, her eyes darting around the room. "This is how it happened before." "What?" "He wanted us to find this, Sophie, just like we did then." "You're not making any sense." "This is how we met the schoolmaster. We found the pen and book on the table. The pen was drawing a picture of us that looked exactly like this one." "Sophie, don't you remember?" Agatha backed away from the storybook. "We were alone in a strange room just like this. We were standing just like this. The historian began our fairy tale in front of our eyes. And then we heard the schoolmaster say behind us, "It must suspect a good ending." A voice echoed. The two girls froze. The voice came from behind them.